Hello everyone, my name is Chelsea Brown and this is my presentation on healthcare and immigration detention centers. First, I have a little content section. First, we will speak about the introduction, followed by background and context, led with major concepts, political and legal issues. Economic issues follows that, and then ethical theories and principles. Ethical framework and application would be number 7. Impacts on health and wellness, followed by learning application. Next is resources and then followed with the conclusion and some references. So, in healthcare and immigration detention centers, there is rising reports of human rights abuses as of 2020. There are a lot of increases in preventable in-custody deaths and numerous violations of autonomy and dignity, including physical abuse, sexual assault, and misuse of solitary confinement. Also, there is overcrowding and safety risks as of 2025. The public health is existent to protect and promote the well-being of populations grounded in ethical values like liberty, privacy, and confidentiality. However, these values are often compromised in immigration detention. The report shows systemic neglect of health and human rights, as found in Saudi 2020. The policies are currently disrupting mixed-status families, separating parents from children, and creating long-term physical and mental health consequences on both the families and the detainees. The concept of slow death will be used throughout the presentation to help us understand the harm. As explained by Lee 2019, slow death stems from structural conditions rather than individual choices. It gradually wears down the health of the population. In detention centers, this plays out in untreated illness, chronic stress, and deteriorating mental health. At the same time, immigration has reached historic highs in 2025 during the Trump administration. This is fueling political tension around detention centers, amplifying the ethical urgency to healthcare delivery in these facilities, as stated by Kim Water in 2005. From a moral standpoint, Scripture reminds us to act with justice and compassion, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another, do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the foreigner, or the poor, says Zechariah in 7:9-10. This call is underscoring the ethical responsibility to protect immigrants' health and dignity even when law enforcement priorities are conflicting. Moving on to the background. Public health is grounded in protecting populations, but immigration detention often compromises ethical values like liberty, privacy, and confidentiality. The concept of slow death shows us how structural conditions cause gradual harm and deterioration of health rather than individual choice. The ethics of healthcare and immigration detention cannot be separated from political and legal landscapes. Legally, detention centers operate under federal immigration authorities, but their practices often raise constitutional and human rights concerns. For example, some legal scholars argue that strict enforcement measures, including mass detention and ending birthright relationships, are constitutional measures and are necessary measures, as stated by Sabowski in 2025. This is reflected on the legal perspective that prioritizing enforcement of immigration law, sometimes at the expense of health protections, is more important in America. On the other hand, public health research shows that immigration enforcement has led to widespread health inequities. There is an increased number of preventable deaths and systemic violations of detainee rights. Moreover, political rhetoric often frames undocumented immigrants as a crime threat. However, research consistently disproves this narrative, showing that such claims are false and very harmful. Finally, with immigration at record levels in 2025, the legal and political debate over detention has intensified, making this both a policy and a public health priority. These tensions are revealing how political and legal frameworks directly shape the health and human rights of immigrants in detention. In Essentials of Public Health Ethics, Bernheim highlights several core concepts that guide ethical reasoning in public health. I have listed six. These concepts are essential to understanding the dilemmas raised by healthcare and immigration detention centers. First is liberty, or the protection of individual freedom. In detention, liberty is restricted, which creates an inherent ethical tension. Second is privacy and confidentiality, both of which are foundational in health practice, but are often compromised in institutional settings like detention centers. Third is justice, which focuses on fairness in the distribution of health resources and ensures that vulnerable populations are not excluded. Another central concept is beneficence, or the obligation to act for the good of individuals and populations paired with non-maleficence, the duty to avoid causing harm. Finally, Bernheim emphasizes that population-level responsibility for ethical public health decisions must consider the collective of the well-being, not just individual outcomes. And all of these major concepts are found in Bernheim through pages 3 to 92. When applied to detention healthcare, each of these concepts is revealing of serious ethical challenges that go way beyond a political or legal stance. It touches on the very foundations of public health ethics. Here I have listed a photo of how overpopulated the detention center cages are and what these people are sustaining, and to how many people need health care while in this detainment center. It is not just a couple people, there is hundreds, and this is not only just one detention center, it is throughout America in majority, if not all, of the detention centers. Moving on to political issue dimensions. So the political authority is the foundation of public health, but it must ethically be justified when restricting liberty, as stated by Bernhardt. The immigration detention centers is highlighted detention as the enforcement of immigration law often conflicts with the responsibility to safeguard health. The political legitimacy depends on the fairness, transparency, and accountability, as claimed by Bernhardt. Yet, practices like family separation have disrupted the legitimacy of this process. Lee 2019 describes that this is a form of slow death. This is when harmful policies gradually deteriorate immigrant well-being. The political debate around immigration also shapes public perception. On one side, we are calling for restrictive measures such as ending birthright citizenship, whereas on the other, evidence is disproving the claim that immigrants drive higher crime rates, exposing how political narratives can distort public health responses, according to Walker, 2025. The rising immigrant the rising immigrant population makes these political tensions impossible to ignore. If you take a look at the screen, there is imagery on what should be America's top priority when addressing immigration be, and this is a poll between Democrats, Republicans, and Independents in 2024 on PBS NewsHour. The options are increased security along the US-Mexico border to reduce illegal crossings, allow immigrants who came to the country illegally as children to remain in the US and apply for legal status, take in refugees who are trying to escape violence and war, and increase deportations of immigrants currently in the country illegally.
Moving on to the legal issues and dimensions. Law defines the government's responsibility to protect health, but also places limits on authority through constitutional protections and civil rights, according to Bernheim. In theory, this means that legal safeguards ensure that healthcare and detention centers respect human rights. However, in practice, these protections are often violated. Saudi 2020 reports that preventable deaths and widespread abuses in detention facilities raise concern about the failure of legal systems to enforce accountability. Immigration law has also been enforced in ways that blur the line between humanitarian protection and national security in 2018. Asylum seeking families were criminalized and accused of child smuggling, illustrating how legal authority can be weaponized against vulnerable populations. Thus, while law should serve as a safeguard and protection in detention, it actually contexts that it amplifies harm rather than preventing it. Moving on to the economic issues. Immigration detention centers pose serious economic challenges for both detainees and the U.S. public health system. According to Saudi 2020, the detention centers often operate with limited healthcare funding, understaffed medical units, and the lack of preventative care. This leads to higher long term costs from a public health ethics perspective. Bernheim 2013 emphasizes that distributive justice, which requires a fair allocation of resources to vulnerable populations, yet billions of taxpayer dollars are spent maintaining detention centers while failing to provide adequate medical care. This raises concerns of fairness and efficiency and the responsible use of public funds, especially given the increasing immigrant population in the United States. Another dimension of the economic issue is the principle of utility, which calls for maximizing benefits while minimizing costs and harm. The detention system fails this principle because poor health care not only harms detainees, but also creates long term financial burdens through preventable illnesses, outbreaks, and lawsuits. Furthermore, Saudi 2020 highlights that limited access to chronic care leads to worsening conditions. Ultimately, this increased costs. A public health ethics framework would argue that a reallocation of funds towards preventative and community based care could reduce harm, save money, and uphold justice more effectively than the current detention standard. In this photo, it is a depiction of how much money immigrants put into the American economy. Moving on to the ethical theories and principles. When analyzing the ethical issues surrounding immigration detention centers, several ethical theories can guide how we evaluate justice, fairness, and responsibility. Utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics can provide a different lens for understanding whether current practices are morally acceptable. By applying these frameworks, we can weigh the benefits and harms while also examining the duties and virtues required in public health ethics. Also, public health ethics also rely on key principles such as autonomy, justice, beneficence, and maleficence. These principles are critical when assessing the treatment of detained immigrants. Reports of abuse, neglect, and lack of medical care highlight direct violations of these principles, especially distributive justice and respect for autonomy. Applying these ethical foundations shows that reform are necessary to align detention practices with both public and health moral responsibility. Three, two, one. Now that we've identified the ethical theories, we can apply them directly to the case of immigration detention. Each theory offers a different perspective, but together they reveal consistent ethical problems within the system. When we apply public health principles, it becomes clear that detention centers undermine the ethical foundations of public health. The lack of respect for autonomy, fairness, and basic care reflects systemic and ethical failures. Such utilitarianism suggests detention centers fail because the harms of abuse, illness, and family separation are outweighed of any public safety benefits. Furthermore, deontological ethics shows that detention practices violate duties to respect human dignity and rights, especially when solitary confinement is misused as a punishment and deterrent. Virtue ethics highlights the absence of compassion and justice in policies that prioritize deterrence and deportation over humane treatment. Autonomy is also denied when detainees cannot make decisions about medical care or family unity. Concurrently, justice is violated because resources are not distributed fairly and immigrants face disproportionate suffering compared to the general population. Next, beneficence is ignored when detention centers fail to provide necessary health care that could improve well being. And lastly, non maleficence is breached because preventable harms such as abuse, neglect, and mental health deterioration are ongoing and systemic. Moving on to the impact of health and wellness. The examination of impact of immigration detention has on health and wellness is not just a direct Next, we will examine the impact immigration detention has on health and wellness. Detention centers are not just administrative facilities, they directly affect the physical and mental well being of detainees. Reports document preventable illnesses and delayed treatment and neglect beyond physical harm. The psychological toll of solitary confinement, uncertainty, and family separation causes lasting trauma for both the detainees and their families. Children and families experience toxic stress that disrupts long-term development. These outcomes demonstrate how current practices undermine health goals of promoting wellness and protecting vulnerable populations. Moving on to learning and application. From examining healthcare and immigration detention centers, we have learned several critical lessons. First, ethical and public health frameworks are necessary to identify systemic failures and protect vulnerable populations. Second, underfunding, neglect, and abuse create preventable harms that can be mitigated with better policies and resource allocation. Finally, this knowledge can be applied to public health practice to develop policies that prioritize human dignity, equitable access to care, and mental and physical wellness. By translating these lessons into practical action, public health professionals are able to prevent harm to the fuller extent, promoting justice and upholding ethical standards for all populations, including immigrants. Moving on, this section reflects on what has been learned from studying healthcare and immigration in detention centers. I have listed 5 as detention centers reveal systemic failures in providing adequate healthcare and protecting human rights. Ethical frameworks and public health principles are essential for evaluating and improving detention practices. Chronic underfunding and understaffing contribute to poor outcomes and medical neglect. Fourth, being mental health needs, especially for children and separated families, remain largely unmet. And lastly, reform requires policy change, ethical oversight, and resource allocation to address ongoing inequities. Research highlights that systemic failures in providing adequate care and protecting rights and promoting wellness. Lessons from these failures emphasize the importance of ethical frameworks, public health principles, and policy oversights. However, gaps remain, including chronic underfunding, lack of accountability, and insufficient attention to mental health needs. Bridging these gaps requires both ethical commitment and practical reform to ensure that detainees receive humane and effective health care. In conclusion, our examination of immigration detention centers through the lens of public health ethics reveals that these facilities represent much more than administrative holding sites. They are environments where political decisions, economic pressures, and systemic inequities create a profound challenge for the health and well-being of vulnerable populations, or in this case, immigration detention centers, detainees. Throughout this presentation, we have seen that these challenges are not isolated incidents, but rather structural issues that reflect broader societal values and choices. By applying ethical theories such as utilitarianism, deontology, and principles of justice, as well as Bernheim's general moral considerations, we find that detention practices often fail to maximize benefits, prevent harm, or even distribute resources fairly. Instead, they disproportionately burden individuals who already face significant vulnerabilities before, during, and after detention. Study work highlights how inadequate medical care, poor conditions, and systemic neglect in detention centers result in preventable harm. Camerata's data underscored the growing immigrant population and the scale of the issue in the United States. Also discussed is the ethical framework that guides us to critically evaluate current practices. The principles of autonomy beneficence, and non-maleficence, and justice provide a roadmap for ethical reform, yet the reality within detention centers shows repeated violations of these principles. Importantly, the concept of the slow death shows that harm accumulates over time through chronic neglect and systemic failure. It is reminding us that the damage inflicted on detainees is often invisible, long-term, and intergenerational. And not only for the detainee, but for their families as well. From a public health perspective, ignoring the conditions in detention centers not only undermines the health of detained individuals, but also poses broader risks to communities through increased health inequities, disrupted social networks, and preventable disease outbreaks. Public trust in the healthcare system is also impacted when care is denied or delayed for marginalized groups. As health professionals and policymakers, and even advocates, recognize that addressing these issues is not simply a policy, legal, or political choice, it is a moral obligation. The ethical framework we rely on calls for justice, fairness, and the promotion of health for all, regardless of immigration status. Real reform requires courage and compassion to ensure that the detention centers uphold basic human rights and align with the core values of the American public health ethics. Ultimately, the conversation about immigration detention is a conversation about who America is as a country and who we are as a society. If it is truly believed that justice and liberty for all means that the treatment of detained immigrants is okay where it's at, our values are not being truly reflected. By closing the gaps in healthcare and reforming systemic practices, we as citizens in America can move closer to a future where dignity, equity, and ethical responsibility is a true part of our public health policies. Next, I have my resources from Bernheim 2013, Camerata 2025, Lee 2019, Sadi 2020, Spagovsky 2025, Walker 2025, and Zechariah 7910. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation.